All right, we're recording and we're off to quickly finish chapter 2 and begin chapter 3. And we left off with the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention, which, as you will recall, left us with our current structure of government concerning the Congress, right? Two chambers within Congress, a House of Representatives with 434 reps from all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, and 100 senators in the other chamber called the Senate, made up of 2 from each state, along with the 2-chamber legislative branch. The whole government, according to our Constitution, is broken into 3 branches. Along with the legislative branch or Congress is the executive branch. And here's a little summaries of all of them. Congress, simplistic summaries, of course, but Congress makes the laws. The executive branch, with the president and the vice president and the cabinet, carries out the laws. Excuse me. And the judicial branch, made up of the Supreme Court and the other federal courts, evaluates or interprets the laws. So our 3 branches of government. Remember, that is a separation of powers. So just think of it this way. Let me give you a free Instructor Bing's visual here. Before, you had, let's just think of a circle, the king. And the king ruled absolutely in many countries in the past. Now, you might have a circle with a line, let's say about 3/4 of the way down, dividing it. And in the big chunk, you had the king, and in the little chunk, you had parliament. So there was a little bit of division of the government. And it would be that way in all the older types of governments. That there would not be, the pieces of the pie would be pretty big. You would have the king or the parliament or the small group of rulers called the oligarchy. But the pie had big pieces, which meant that the authority of the government was not very divided. What our founders did was, with the separation of powers, with the concept of federalism, which we're going to get into in chapter 3, and even within, even within each branch of government, the Congress is divided into 2 bodies. The presidency, or the executive branch, even though the president is the chief executive, has a vast cabinet around him. And today, the executive branch is very, very big and complicated, because our government has grown in the 240 years that we've been a country. And then the judicial branch has always been divided between the main Supreme Court and then the lower federal court. So the American pie, don't confuse it with the cake analogy. The American pie would have a lot of slices to dilute government power so that no one individual or body of individuals has the majority of the power. There is one thing, right, that is the supreme ruler of our country. And what is that? I'm not talking about God. Maybe I'm getting ahead, but you guys should have covered it in your worksheets. There was someone there eager to answer. Huh?
What was the question?
No one person or group of people is the supreme ruler of our land, but there is something that is the supreme. Maybe this will help you. The supreme
Court.
blank of the land.
Yeah, Supreme Court. Yeah.
Not the Supreme Court.
Oh,
Congress?
supreme law? No.
Supreme law.
Oh.
Oh.
Constitution.
I thought it was Supreme Land. I don't know.
And we're going to get into that
Supreme
with
land of the
federalism.
land.
But the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so nobody is above the law, right? As we're seeing right now being played out in the news. Nobody, not even a former president, is above the law. All right. So we're going to move from that slide presentation. Let's see here. This just compares the articles and the Constitution. I'm going to post these chapter 2 slides today after class. So let's go to the next slide presentation. But before we jump into chapter 3, we've got to cover one quick thing because I really wanted to comment on this about from chapter 2. There was another compromise that you were to describe in your chapter 2 worksheet. That is the 3/5 compromise. And I really want to talk about this for a little bit because you may, in the course of your life, hear someone say, oh, the Constitution was written by a bunch of racists who wanted to keep slavery alive and they put it in the Constitution. But hopefully, as you read about it, you were able to comprehend that they didn't have it in the Constitution to keep it because they wanted to keep it forever. There was a reason why slavery is mentioned in the Constitution. And I'm going to share with you why it's in there for the ultimate purpose of getting rid of it. Okay, it's very important. You should have read that when they were debating the legislative branch in the Constitutional Convention, right? And they had come up with a great compromise, having a House of Representatives that would help the small states, but then the Senate that would help the larger states. There was an issue of slavery, and pretty much everybody in the northern states, at the time of the Constitutional Convention wanted to get rid of slavery. Remember, slavery was only at this time in the southern states with the big plantation owners. Several of the northern states, maybe all of them, I can't recall for sure, had outlawed slavery in their colonies. So, if the House of Representatives allows each state so many reps based on their population, the leaders in the southern states saw they saw a kind of like a golden egg here. The southern states had larger populations because they had all the slaves there. And so it would mean that they would get a lot more reps, and therefore they would be able to control, in a sense, the legislative branch. Now, the northern states felt like, okay, if there's more people in the southern states, if we counted slaves, then we will get more taxes, and that's a good thing. The federal government will get more taxes. So you can see here on this graph, the southern states wanted slaves to be counted as population so that they would get more reps, but they did not want them to be counted for the purpose of taxes. The northern states did not want to count them for the purpose of representatives, but they did want to count them for the purpose of taxes. And so that's what led to this other compromise called the Three-Fifths Compromise. They said that for every 5 slaves in the southern states, they would be counted as 3 people. And or every slave would, technically would be considered 3/5 of a person. This was not a result, or this was not based on their personal beliefs. This was not based on the racism that we hear about today that is based on hatred. This is not like white supremacists of today hating blacks today. The founders were not white supremacists according to today's definition. You cannot take modern definitions and apply them to people who had a different way of thinking hundreds of years ago. So, but we do realize that the southern population of whites considered slaves to be property. Now, I told you that the reason this was in the Constitution was to eventually get rid of slavery. And here's how that works. The northern delegates to the Constitutional Convention, they understood that if they came right out and said, no, slaves will not be counted for representatives, and we'll compromise and say that slaves will not be counted for taxes, the southern states would have then broke away from the Union. In other words, the Civil War would have happened 87 years before it did. It would have happened And there might not have been a war, but there would not have been a union of the 13 states, which would be called the United States of America. They might not have gone to war, but they might have broken into two separate countries. So the Northern delegates understood that they had the foresight to realize that slavery was starting to be done away with in not only in the states, in the colonies, but in other parts of the world. Slavery was starting to be looked down upon. And so they made this compromise so that the Southern states would not have more influence in Congress. And eventually they believed that as more states are added, because remember, there's all that Western territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as more states are added, then eventually we can do away with slavery. Now, it did happen that 87 years later, or about 88 to 89 years later, slavery was done away with, but it did require, unfortunately, a civil war that cost us 56,000 American lives. But I just wanted to touch on that because if you hear people say that, if you hear them say, and they say it in a very general, in a very general, condescending way, oh, the founders put slavery in the Constitution because they were racist and they wanted to own slaves. That is not, that is a misrepresentation. And students, you're going to see that a lot of times things in history are not always black and white. There's a lot of gray. There's a lot of details that you have to dig down into to arrive to the truth. Am I saying that there was no racism? No, there was. It was just not the exact same racism based on hatred that there is today. It was based on, remember the great chain of being? It was also based on an emerging scientific way of thinking. Don't have time to talk about that, but let's move on to, let me show you, you'll want to remember Montesquieu for the test. He was one of those political philosophers. He happened to be from France, remember, and he was the one who believed in the separation of powers. But bicameralism, you covered that in your in your worksheet, so I'm not going to go over that. I did want to mention, and glad I had this on here, the checks and balances was another way. Another, you know, those are the mechanisms so that each branch can kind of keep tabs on the other branches. And so you'll be able to check that out when I post these slides, but let's go ahead and move on to chapter 3. Give me a brief second here to find the textbook. So if you want to follow along, beginning chapter 3 on page 71. All right, so you guys can see me right now, right? Okay. So let me share go back to the slides. Okay, federalism. Federalism is not to be confused with the separation of powers, although it is very similar. The separation of powers are the three branches of the federal or national government. I'm going to try to do this as clear as possible because it could get confusing. Separation of powers are the three branches of government in the national government, sometimes called the federal government, or sometimes the central government. Federalism not to be confused with federal, but we've added ISM to federal, is a system of government in which powers, and I want you to think of more of power in the terms of authority, are divided and shared by the central government, which is the federal or national government, and in the case of our government, the United States of America, the lower state governments. So separation of powers is a division of just this government right here, the national, federal, central government. Federalism is where there is a system in which the central government is functioning with lower level governments. And in our system, it's not just states, but it's also counties, right? Counties and towns. We have 4 levels of government in our federalism: national, state, county, and town. And this is where there are levels of authority. The authority that each of those governments have is divided and shared by the different governments. All right, so I'm going to try to make that clear as mud. Oh, I'm sorry, clear as water from the beautiful Poto River, right? Okay, we have already talked about separation of powers. We'll come back to the Bill of Rights. We're still going to stay on federalism here. Hold on one sec with me. What we're going to talk about here when we talk about federalism hello, goodbye, I'm going back, is those different powers that I wanted you to take note of in your chapter 3 worksheet: implied powers, enumerated powers, police power, all of those different powers. So why did the framers want federalism? Because a a strong government, a strong federal government, a strong state government poses a threat to our individual liberty. And that's where the Bill of Rights is going to come in. So the use of the system of federalism, the structure of a separation of powers, and the mechanisms of checks and balances all are going to be working to restrain the government from exercising abuse and overreach of authority on individual citizens. Because remember, our founders believed that the government gets their authority from us and they answer to us, and we are just giving them authority to protect us, and to provide an environment in which we can, right, have our equality of opportunity, where each person has freedom and liberty to use their talents and their abilities and their wealth, however big or small that might be, to thrive. Federalism is a system of government in which a written constitution. So here is another component to federalism. There is a written constitution that is going to serve as the ultimate authority. And so for our Constitution, we did divide the powers of government. And even it's not just divided between the national government, between a executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch, but even in our system of one central government and all the smaller state governments, the Constitution divides the powers on a territorial basis between that central government and the state governments. So what we're saying is certain powers belong to the national government, certain powers belong to the states. And then there's some powers which are shared by both the national government and the state government. Questions? Let's do a little stretching. Let's move our shoulders and wake up. Let's look to the right and look to the left and just kind of wake up. Yes. 11:33, I got 12 minutes to continue on. All righty. Now, the framers forgot to include a separation of powers in marriage, right? It should have been equal man and woman, right? But as it is, it's woman dominates man in marriage, right? That's kind of a joke, y'all. It's okay. I've got honeydews to do, so I know what I'm talking about. Get used to those words, Camden and Job, honeydews. That's what you have to do for your honey. It's not just a melon. Okay, how did I get off on that? So here's a federal system compared to other types of government systems. You can see here that a unitary system is in which the national government and the state government all the power is concentrated in these two bodies. A confederation, which we had underneath the Articles of Confederation, was we had the two divisions of state and national, but there was a decentralized power. The states still were above the national government. In the federal system, the people are the governing authorities, and we elect the representatives and the leaders who will serve on the state level and the national level, and we're going to divide their powers because the authority is going to rest with the people, which ultimately comes from the Constitution, which includes the Bill of Rights, our individual rights. All right, so here is another way of looking at it using concentric circles. Don't you just love concentric circles? This is where all the powers are going to come in. So there are expressed powers. Remember what those were? Those are powers that are clearly spelled out in the Constitution. Powers that the Senate, or I'm sorry, that the Congress and the president can exercise. So you'll have in the Constitution that the legislative branch has the power to tax. So that is an expressed power to levy taxes on the citizens or upon the states. And as the textbook points out, there's 17 express powers that are given in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the legislative branch. And while many people will say that the three government branches have equal power, I tend to think that the legislative branch has a little bit more muscle, because they are the first branch that is talked about, and it has more written information about it. All right. So the next power is implied powers. This is that phrase that says Congress is enabled to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out or carrying into execution the foregoing powers. As you did learn, right, the necessary and proper clause. That's what the implied powers are. It's based on the necessary and proper clause. Has Congress over the years made laws that are not a part of the original 17 based on this necessary and proper clause? Have they made laws? Yes, they have. They have done that. And then there's the inherent powers. The inherent powers. Excuse me for 1 second. your instructor has slept since the last time I discussed these powers. I'll have to, and this just goes to show that your instructors do not know all things. So that's okay. I'll have to refresh myself on inherent powers. Maybe one of you is up on that. But all of these powers, and this might be more inherent, might be more relevant to the executive branch, the president, in which the president, starting especially with Teddy Roosevelt came to the conclusion that if the Constitution doesn't forbid something, in other words, it doesn't say this is a power of the presidency, it's not expressed, but it doesn't forbid, then the president should use the presidency as a bully pulpit. The president should do things that are for the good of the country. And so it's not in the Constitution, but it's not forbidden by the Constitution. Inherent. So for example, during Roosevelt's presidency, some coal miners went on strike in, I believe, Tennessee, maybe West Virginia. And at that time, we were highly dependent upon coal. The coal miners went on strike because they were working in these coal mines and getting paid a very poor wage. So they wanted to be paid better. So they went on strike. Well, before Teddy Roosevelt, the national government sided pretty much all the time with big business. But Roosevelt, even though he was a guy who came from a rich home, rich background, he felt like the coal companies, and specifically the coal company that was in charge of the West Virginia coal mines, should pay the workers a decent wage. So in this case, the government was on the side of the people, the coal miners. And Teddy tried to bring the coal miners and the coal mining company, he tried to bring them in together to work it out. But the coal mining company refused. And so Teddy used the government power to send the military into West Virginia, and the military were going to start working in the coal mines. Well, this kind of lit a fire underneath the company and the coal mine workers, and they worked something out. But that was an example of Roosevelt not exercising an express power, but he felt like it was an inherent power that he could exercise. So as we finish up, these powers are delegated powers by the Constitution to the national government. But these powers are not given to the states, but there are powers that are concurrent powers, which means both the national government and the state governments can both do these things. So that's where these circles meet here in the middle. An example of a concurrent power is the power to tax, right? You pay federal taxes. Here in Oklahoma, we pay state taxes. So both governments, national and state, share that power, so it's a concurrent power. Some powers are only reserved for the states. And we'll pick up there when we reassemble on Ben Franklin Friday, where I will remember to have